This lecture will be dedicated to the subject of taking notes. So this has been my kind of mantra throughout these lectures, and that is to write a good paper, you have to learn something and think about what you have learned. And note-taking is really a part of that. Now, taking notes is something people generally don't like to do. It takes a lot longer to take notes, right? If you just read something, you kind of skim it through, then you can do it very quickly. But if you take notes on something, it takes much longer. Now, the problem is that if you do that, you oftentimes don't retain much. People, when you're just reading something to just read it, you don't really remember much because you're not reading it to learn something. You're reading it just because, well, it was assigned and I just need to do it so I can say I did it, and then I won't feel bad or guilty. But that's not, of course, how you learn anything, right? You need to learn. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to write a paper. Now, in the previous lecture, right, I talked about how to find good research materials and how you can locate this information, figure out what it is you need to read, so you don't read a whole bunch of stuff you don't need. And one reason I want people to do that is so that way they can read very closely what they do need to read and take notes on it. Right? So, and taking notes, like I say, it takes longer, but it's a good investment of your time. And it's a good investment for a couple of reasons. One of the big things is that it helps you to actually learn the material. By writing out notes in your own words, you're making sure you actually understand what it is you're reading. There's a saying, if you can't teach something to someone, you don't really know it, right? You don't really understand it. So taking notes actually helps you learn the material, right? You're reading it, you have to process it, and then you have to write it out. Notice I'm not saying highlighting. People often highlight, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. You don't want to do that in a library book. It has to be your own book or own article. But the thing is, a lot of times that just makes it feel like you're doing something when you're not really doing much of anything, right? Actually writing out or typing out your own notes, and for this class you need to type them out, is going to help you learn because it's helping you process that information. It's helping you remember that information. And the other reason it's very important to take notes is you're going to forget details. It's just what's going to happen. Your professors, whenever we come in and give a lecture, before we lecture, we have to review. We have to kind of remind ourselves what it is that we're lecturing about, because otherwise we'll forget some things that are important. So it's always important to take notes because it helps you to learn the material, and it also creates a record that will help you to refresh it in your own mind later on. And that's going to be important, right? If you read a book in the second week of class and you need it in that material in the 10th week, you're probably not going to remember it. But if you take good notes, you'll have it right there. So I just want to stress, this is going to take time to do, but it is a very good investment of your time. In the long run, it saves you time and helps you write a good paper. It is very important when taking notes that you make it clear what source those notes are coming from. So first of all, you need to make a file, a separate file for each source. And what I mean by that is a separate computer file. So, if you're using Microsoft Word, you would have one document for each separate source, even if it's short. And that way you'll make sure that you don't accidentally mix up notes. You'll make sure that this note sources, the notes for this source stay with this source, so that later on you'll know for citation purposes which source goes with what information. Now, another key thing I want to emphasize about taking notes that can help you is to either photocopy the chapter that you're taking notes from or to print out the article you're taking notes from. Sometimes people are a little stingy with paper, but with this paper that you're writing, I think it's good to avoid being penny wise, pound foolish. That's why one reason I try and keep the textbook cost low. I want people to print things out. I want you to write on, a photocopy or a printout of a journal article. This is especially true for your primary sources, particularly if you're getting them off of the internet. If you're using an online primary source collection, you really need to print them out. That way you can write on them directly, you can interact with them, and that will help you later to find information, and also will help you type up your notes. So a lot of times when I am reading something the first time, I'll read it through kind of quickly and then just take notes in the margins about the important parts, underline things that I think are important, and then later on I can go up and type up my notes. But this will help you to learn the material better They help you retain it and help you find it later on when you need it. So I just want to stress, don't be stingy with the paper, especially when you're dealing with primary sources. Now, when you are typing notes, you want to make sure that you preserve the chapter and heading information, right? You don't want to just type out a bunch of notes, because later on when you have to look at it, you're just going to be looking at all this writing and it's not going to be clear what comes from where. So I'll give you an example later on, but whenever I take notes, and I type up my notes, when I say take notes, I'm talking about typing them up on a computer. I write out the chapter, so I'll write chapter 1, and then I'll write out the page numbers for that chapter, and then under it, I'll put all the different headings. Remember in the previous section, we talked about all these different headings. That makes it really easy to find the material later on. And then you also want to make sure you write down the page numbers. So if you're, and in particular, if you read something, you're like, wow, that's really good, I need to quote that, you need to write down the exact page of the quotation, or pages if it's a really long quotation. But if your quotation only is on one page, you don't want to give a page range of 20 pages. You need to make it easy for someone to find your quotations. And by the way, if we have trouble finding your quotations, that to us is a sign that maybe you were either sloppy in your research or you're trying to trick your professors, which sometimes people do. And that will, we will deal with that. But basically, you want to make sure when you take notes that it's clear where you're getting it from. So, like I said, you provide page numbers, and if the material is more general, you can just kind of provide a page range. But if you run across a number or a quote or something very specific that you know you're going to cite later, write down the page in your notes. It'll be much easier later to find that information again, and it'll be much easier to make your bibliography and footnotes. So keep that in mind. Now, as a general rule, you're probably asking yourself, okay, well, I've got a skeleton here of a outline. What do I need to write down? Well, and we'll talk more about this later, but in general with historical writing, one paragraph has a main idea, right? Each paragraph of a well-written journal article or book chapter has one key idea. And so my recommendation is that you should make in your notes for each paragraph one sentence or bullet point. Right? Remember, these are your notes. They don't have to be perfectly grammatically correct. They need to be something that you can understand later on. So it can be in bullet point form. But the key thing is, in general, each paragraph should have one sentence or bullet point. That's, it takes a while to do this, but this will make sure you actually understand the article or the chapter. Like I said, you don't want to read extensively, you want to read intensively. You want to understand the material so you can reflect it and deal with it and integrate it. Now, this is the key thing. Now, one thing I want to stress, this is, when I talk about taking notes, I'm not saying you just sit down with a new book and start taking notes. Remember, we already talked about in a previous lecture how you kind of go through the material quickly to find out the useful sections, right? I'm not saying sit down and read a 300-page book and take notes on every single paragraph. No, I'm saying you locate the relevant parts, then you take note, and you maybe take very broad notes on those relevant parts, you just mark down the parts that are relevant. Then you go back through to the very important parts, and that's where you take these very detailed notes. Now, that's why I say on this section, you can skim it first, and maybe make very broad general notes, and then later on, you can go through and make more specific notes. You might find in one section, you only need a couple bullet points or sentences to describe the sentence. You don't need to write a sentence for every paragraph. On the other hand, for some very detailed writing, very close to what you're studying, you'll find that you're going to need more than one sentence per paragraph. So you just scale it based on how important this information is to your paper. So here's an example of some notes that I took, right? I've been talking in the kind of generally. Now I want to give you a specific example. So I created a file for a book I was reading called Cold Days in Hell, American POWs in Korea. And I saved the name under the title, right? The file I named after the title. And there you can see at the top, that's not in any correct bibliographic format because you're going to have to move that information around depending on what you're doing. But it has all the necessary information so that you could write a footnote or bibliography. So one thing I recommend, the first thing you do when you have a source you know you're going to use is you do this, right? You set up the, you have the bibliographic information at the top. You save it under the title of the book. And there you can see I have a couple sections, right? I have the prologue, the beginning. I just note what was important about the prologue. And there's the page numbers. Introduction, pages 4 through 6. Again, I just went through and wrote some of the important things for each paragraph. And this is basically, you can see at the top part says criticism of conduct of American soldiers. That whole sentence is describing like the first paragraph. And then the second paragraph, communist successful, so on forth and so on. And then you notice that third thing says two major issues, right? A lot of times a government or in a paper or an article or a chapter, someone will say, I'm going to look at 3 things, or I'm going to look at 2 things. That's really important. It's oftentimes good to note those 2 things. So here I noted that he's trying to understand, the author's trying to understand why American POWs sometimes didn't act the way they were supposed to, why they made confessions, criticizing the United States and so forth. And he argues there's 2 major issues here. One was how was the enemy use of propaganda, and the other was how they basically manipulate these Americans in order to make them talk or behave in a certain way. And then this was basically became a political issue and was exaggerated beyond what it should have been. And part of what he's trying to do is try and correct that through this book. So this is key, right? I haven't read this book for several years, but looking at this, my notes, I can remember the book. So this is the key thing. Like I said, this saves you time in the long run. And if we go on, you can see up there, it says in bold, it says 1, the summer soldiers, and it gives a page range. Again, that's bold because that shows a chapter, right? That's chapter 1. And then below it, it says America Responds, pages 9 through 11. That is a section within that chapter. And you'll notice I have the chapter in bold and then the heading within the chapter in italics and the pages after them. That makes it really easy for me then to remember where I got that information from. Right? Okay, I got that from these pages. That makes citing the information so much easier later on. Right? That makes citing that information so much easier later on. So that's one thing I highly encourage you to do when you write your notes. It's a pain when you're first doing it, but it saves you time in the long run, and it helps you really learn this information. And again, you can tell, from this, these aren't necessarily always grammatically correct. There may be a misspelling here and there. That's fine for your notes, as long as it's not in a quote. The main thing is it's helping you kind of remember this information for later. Now that was general stuff, right? I gave just the page range for the headings because those headings all contain kind of related information that's all connected. So I know when I cite it, I'll probably cite all that stuff together. So I gave page ranges. But the other thing sometimes is that you're going to have happen is you're going to quote some material. This is a page from my notes on a book called Protestantism, A Short Introduction. And I used that book when I taught History 201. And it's one thing that I thought was very important to have the students discuss was the issue of how the author defines Protestantism, right? And especially when an author is talking about definitions, it's good to pay attention. So when I read it, I actually copied out the whole introduction into my notes, right? At the top there it says some coherence nonetheless. That is the heading that the author used. And under it, the author gave a definition, and there I'm giving a definition. Now, it says 5, that's because that's the page number, comma, historical definition. That's just my words to help me remind it that I consider this definition kind of a historical definition. There's other ways you could define it. And then I just wrote it out. And then you'll notice it continues. I skipped a space, and then it continues. That's because the author himself moved to like another paragraph and had some other stuff in between, and I didn't want to get confused and think that that these 2 quotes were directly connected. They're not. That's why I have a line between them to help me remember that. So since here this is a quote, you need to give the exact page that it's on, because that will make it easier for someone else to find it. Again, if we read a paper that doesn't have the exact page, we get suspicious and we think maybe someone's trying to make up something or is just being sloppy. Now, when you use primary sources in particular, it's very good to copy out lots of quotes. And I have to stress this. Basically, for historians, one of the most important kinds of evidence we have are quotations from documents or people or something, right? How do we know this person said this? Well, this is here, it's in this diary. Or if we want to analyze something, if we want to describe, this is how American Civil War soldiers understood Jesus or God or something like that, we need those quotes. You cannot write a paper without good primary source quotes. And a lot of times, to be perfectly blunt, when I take notes, I copy out a lot of primary source material. And then what happens is it makes it really easy to write my paper because I can just kind of mix it all together. And then I just write sentences to link and analyze those primary source documents together. So one thing I really, really want to emphasize is finding good primary sources and then copying out information from them that is helpful. This will help you to understand the primary sources better. It's a pain because you're sitting there typing out primary sources and you're like, I've already, it's written right here. Why do I need to type this out? Well, again, it will help you to remember the material and you'll have it there and ready. And when you write your paper, it will make writing a paper so much easier. So I really want to emphasize the importance of copying out primary sources into your notes. You don't necessarily have to type up everything, but whenever you see something related to what you're looking at, it's good to type it up. Now, the last thing I have to stress is backing up the materials. One reason that I have you upload various documents and assignments onto Blackboard is, of course, because my handwriting is terrible and I can make comments much more efficiently on Blackboard. I can't lose a paper on Blackboard. I've never actually lost a paper, but it's impossible for me to lose it on Blackboard. There's a lot of good reasons to have people hand stuff in on Blackboard. But one particularly good reason is that then we have an electronic copy. So if something happens to your research, you'll have a copy, right? If you know, and this is key, students will occasionally have their computers die on them. And it's really terrible when you're only, you spent hours and hours doing all this research and then your hard drive crashes and you lost it all. That's pretty awful. And so one reason why I want people to upload all these different documents and drafts and things, if that happens, we've got a copy. So you don't have to redo all that research. That being said, it's still important, I think, for you to back up things yourself. And there's different ways you can do this. For $30 or $40, you can actually buy a very cheap USB hard drive. And I usually use one of those hard drives to back up my computer every week or two. Another thing you can use is Dropbox. Dropbox is a free program that you can download. And I think you get 2 gigabytes free, and it's an online one. You just have to be careful, because if you delete something on Dropbox, it deletes it everywhere. But Dropbox is really cool because it allows you to work on multiple computers. So if you set up a Dropbox account on your home computer, and then you have another one on like an office computer, which is what I use, I can access the same document. So that's an example of and I can make changes. If I make a change on my computer at the office, it automatically also makes a change with the computer at home. In any case, the key thing here, however you do it, even if it's just a USB drive, constantly back up your materials because terrible things can happen. It's so easy to lose all your research very quickly. And so things get stolen, things break. So I highly recommend you to get Dropbox, to get an external hard drive, to have a USB drive, anything that will let you consistently back up your materials. And I would recommend backing them up at least every week. You don't want all that hard work to go to waste. So that being said, that has been our lecture on note-taking. I hope you will have fun taking lots and lots of notes.